The Years of National Government. Chapter 2. The Town. Social Classes. It wouldn't be true to believe that it was only the workers who suffered greatest from the terrible waste of human life during the First World War. To encourage men to enlist, the War Department set up enlistment offices in each town and major industry, calling for all fit men. This naturally meant that the men making up a battalion knew each other, went to school with each other, danced with the same girls, married within the circle, and were of all the same social network. In many of the battles, some battalions lost over half their men. They were replaced early on by other men from the same holding battalions back home. And once again, when in battle, more men were lost. This meant in certain towns and sections of society, whole swathes of men were missing. When the troops went over the top, they were naturally led by mainly junior officers, and these junior officers were also from the same catchment area supplying the enlisted men. And again in battle, some battalions lost all their junior officers, and these men were mainly from the upper middle classes, from the landed gentry. After the war, many of the families owning large estates, holding positions of responsibility, likely to be future heads of the family, were dead, and in many cases their younger brothers were dead too. In time, their parents were too old and impoverished to retain and manage the family home, business, and estate. So these were broken up and sold to maintain their own home, which ultimately became too much, and that too was sold. And this is what happened, starting gradually after the war until the older, moneyed population had died. By about 1938, 20 years after the war had ended, the social classes lost a tier at the top, and shortly it was to lose a tier at the bottom. The First World War sounded the death knell of the next generation of landed gentry, and to some extent to the aristocrats as well. It speeded up what was likely to take place by natural evolution. Taxation, in the form of death duties, saw to it that over a period of time there would be a redistribution of wealth. The Enclosure Act forced some of the poor off the land. They gravitated, as did others, to the towns and factories. The agricultural depression at the end of the 19th century changed the balance of the working population between town and country. The war hurried this along. The 1919 budget raised death duties to 40% to estates over 2 million. 1 million acres of land were sold over that year, and by the end of 1921, a quarter of England had changed hands. A quarter of agricultural land had too passed from being tenanted into that of the farmer owner. Land sales had reached their peak. 3 years of land sales now, the new owners totted up what their purchases had given them. The repeal of the Corn Production Act saw massive grain imports from Canada, America, and Russia. The price of cereals plummeted, and what large estates had survived started again to be split up and houses attached to them sold, to become detached dwellings. A quarter of country houses were torn down and left derelict. And by the first years of the Second World War there was less arable land, and what land there was not being farmed properly. It took the war and the Ministry of Agriculture and Fisheries to take Britain close to self-sufficiency. The result of all this was a large reduction of wealth owned by the top 1% of the population, mainly the landed gentry. This land found its way to the next social layer down. 75% of Britain's population still held less than £100 in their estate. The change in the population's occupations from country to town, from work in the land to work in the production line, gave an opportunity for skills to be learned and entrepreneurship to blossom. This flattened out the social class graph and reduced the layers. Within this now reduced or flattened out layer of wealth is accorded a class position defined by occupation, background, education, speech, fashion and hobby, giving social structure. For those who are interested in such things and where they fit into the structure, the concept is of interest, for it's a perceived thing. You may like to think of yourself as belonging to one class, but your neighbours might not agree with you. In the period and setting we're discussing, 1929 to 1939, in suburban Harrow, class was not of overriding concern. There weren't any aristocrats, gentlemen, or gentry, rich men without occupation. There was a working environment of mainly men, travelling to and from their work mostly by rail. There were very few cars, and the local bus routes took prospective rail passengers to access a different rail network. It wasn't an area of heavy industry, textiles, mining or farming, but one of light engineering, service industries, office and shop work. North Harrow didn't have any grand houses. Its premier houses lined the Pinner Road leading to Harrow. They had an extra living bedroom, a living room and bedroom above, and were detached and designed in a similar style to the rest of the town. If North Harrow had no houses for the very rich, it neither had houses for the very poor. The town was made up of similar houses. Some streets had a better place upon the map, close to the park, others had trees that lined the road, and those that backed onto the railway, positioned next to the shops or linked to the council houses, had a disadvantage, but in the main all were very much like each other, held a suburban likeness. Railways. The first railway to be opened locally was the London and Birmingham Railway, later to be called the London and North Western, in 1837. It ran from Euston to Boxmoor, passing through Harrow. It was later to be called Harrow and Wealdstone Station. A second line, the Metropolitan, originally ran from Paddington to Farringdon, operating in 1863 as the first underground railway, and over the next 20 years was extended, linking up the District Railway and the Inner Circle in 1884. During this time, branch lines ran from Baker Street to Swiss Cottage in 1868 and Willesden to Harrow in 1880, and this was extended to Pinner 5 years later, a station being built there within the year. It took a further 12 years to push the track laying to Chesham, Chalfont, Watford and Amersham and Aylesbury. By the turn of the century, the company had stretched over 50 miles from central London, out into Buckinghamshire. The whole railway was electrified by 1905, and by 1927 North Harrow Station was up and running. The electric Metropolitan District Line, inaugurated in 1904, operated between Park Royal and Roxeth, which included a halt at Rayners Lane. The company wasn't slow in planning the purchase of additional land for more lines, sidings and depots, and this land was negotiated on the principle that the land could be used for other purposes if necessary. And in the event, it was used for housing instead. The first housing estates were built at Wembley and Pinner in the early 1900s. A few years later, more land was let to go all along the line, which was only brought to a halt by the First World War. However, the start of the war didn't stop the railway company's publicity department continuing to operate, and before its operations temporarily closed down, its declared policy aim was to publicise the line. It had adopted the brand name of Metroland to title an advertising brochure aimed at promoting the company's land for development. This was not a one-off publication, for it continued publication for another 12 years until the Metropolitan Railway ceased trading as an independent company before becoming part of London Transport. Metropolitan Line. In January 1990, a property company called the Metropolitan Railway Country Estates Limited was set up to manage and develop the railway's holdings. It was this company's policy to plan and build residential estates all along the line, including Pinner, North Harrow, Rayners Lane, Northwick Park and Eastcote. The scale of the enterprise required the services of local property developers, who were allowed to build to their own specifications. To advertise the housing projects all along the railway's route, maps, timetables and station posters carried detailed accounts of the sites, plans and local facilities. This was done under the slogan, "A better way of life," and "Rural traditions with civilized progress." This marketing ploy worked, and the houses were soon snapped up, not just for owner occupation but for investors renting out property. Public transport. Buses. Tramways were laid at the end of the 19th century. They were company-owned horse tramways. By 1897, electric tramways were operated. A number of tramway companies formed the Tramways and Light Railway Association, and it wasn't long before the Omnibus Owners Association was formed to look after the interests of the horse-drawn public transport. In the 1920s and 30s, the three forms of public transport, buses, trolleybuses and trains, operated in and around London. The Road Traffic Act of 1930 regulated road transport. Harrow, outer London suburbs. North Harrow didn't appear on the map by chance. It was ordained by the government of the day and the local authority planning department to cater for the increase in population and expanding businesses in and around the capital city. The problems of mass unemployment and the need for stimulate the economy led the government to press local councils for the need to produce residential schemes for house building and instigate the ancillary projects to service that increase in population. The Government Acts of 1919 and 1925 ordered 10 council houses estates to be built. Amongst these was one of 53 houses to be erected in North Harrow. Roads can easily be laid, then linking to existing ones. Railways required landowners and affected local authorities to sell and grant planning permission to travel beyond the proposed building site to link up with existing road systems. Road networks. The need for workers' houses close to their work, the location of the country's capital city London on a main river with warehouses and dockland facilities, turned the southeast of England into Britain's most populous place. People and goods need to be moved from home to work, from factory to warehouse. Rivers, canals, roads and railways are essential for moving troops, supplying goods, communication and personal travel. The direction of city developments happened along its lines of communication, both the roads and railways. As the city expanded, farmland was built over. In 1929, the most desirable land left close to London of easy access to a railway was in Middlesex and Hertfordshire. The suburban sprawl of settlements along the railways came to Harrow, North Harrow and Pinner, following the main Harrow and Pinner Road in the early 30s. Before the First World War, most people and goods travelled by the power of the horse. After the war, the use of steam and then petrol to power motors accelerated the development of paved highways, and improvements in road construction continued apace. The unemployed were given relief work, which further accelerated what had begun, and this government-sponsored unemployment relief pushed forward road construction. More vehicles were manufactured, giving a stimulus to proposals for arterial routes and side roads. Under the Local Government Act of 1929, county councils became responsible for county highways in their areas. They in turn proposed the building of town and city bypasses to ease congestion. As the new garden towns were built in Metroland, so the road layouts progressed to cover all the open fields. The outbreak of war in 1939 brought an end to the expansion of trunk road construction, but towards the end of the war the ministry favoured the provision of a network of high-standard routes. Post-war saw the enactment of the 1946 Trunk Road Act. North Harrow, Pinner and Rayners Lane. North Harrow lies between Harrow and Pinner on the Metropolitan Railway, which runs on an east-to-west bearing. Harrow, a main railway junction, services 3 railway companies. Pinner, in the north-eastern corner of Harrow parish, was a large medieval hamlet in 1750, enlarged to village status 100 years later, when town by the turn of the century. Pinner Town had an existing railway station built at the time the track was laid, and both these towns were situated on the A404 Pinner Road. Housing developments. The development of farmland started in the 1920s and 30s. The electrification of the London and North Western Railway in 1917 and permission given to the Piccadilly line to run over the Metropolitan District line in 1932 gave access to most of that land. By 1933 there were 21 stations, including North Harrow, available for commuters. Baker Street Station was the company's headquarters, incorporating the largest and most luxurious apartment block in London, which was completed in 1929. Land speculation and property development operated over the whole area continuously from 1925 till 1939, and by 1926 the road layout was mapped out and road building started. Provisions made for main servicing included, and by 1939 the network was complete. In 1933, Harrow Urban District Council produced residential schemes for house building using the existing main access roads of Harrow Road and Pinner Road to accommodate Alexandra Avenue, Imperial Drive and George V Avenue, and side roads led off main thoroughfares, giving today's existing road layout. On a north-south axis, North Harrow lies between Wealdstone to the north and Rayners Lane to the south, on the A4090, situated on the crossroads of 2 main arterial roads. The local authorities appreciated the need to build a new town with all its attendant services at this place. Private house building flourished in the 1920s and 30s, and by 1932 building was continuous along the railway, referred to as ribbon development, and main roads from Harrow to Pinner, Wealdstone to Rayners Lane. Most of the countryside between Pinner and Roxeth was built during the 30s, and by 1938 North Harrow was complete in all respects. House ownership. It's difficult now to explain the average worker's feelings and opinions regarding house ownership prior to the First World War and shortly afterwards, for only a very small percentage of the population owned their own house. This 10% of owner-occupiers bought because they had the money to do so, without needing a loan. Many aristocrats, landed gentry and upper classes rented either their own home or a second home in the country. It was the done thing. There was no shame in not owning your own home. The rent was low, and you had the benefit of being able to move quickly, as a job became available. As inflation was low and static, there was no point in buying to hedge inflation or to use as a long-term investment. To a degree, this attitude was accepted as normal and not questioned. There was, however, a certain amount of what's the point of owning a house and having to maintain it, then having to pass it on? Why should I save for another generation? With a growing family, you could move to increase the number of bedrooms without overextending your income. Then, when the children left, you could rent something smaller, as your income became smaller in retirement. At least 10% of the population lived in tied accommodation. Policemen, firemen, estate workers, mill workers, railway workers, servants, miners, land workers, the armed services and teachers. The house went with the job. In the 20s, houses held about 1/4 of the country's annual fixed capital security, and 10 years later, the amount was 1/3. Architectural style. During this period, over 3 million homes were built. The architectural style of the period was arts and crafts, a style of decoration with a romantic return to previous ages using solid wood panelling and Georgian windows. Mock Tudor, aping the Tudor period with sham wooden framing and leaded lights, and cottage-style long sloping tiled roofs and divided windows. The lower and outer walls were built of red brick above, pebble dash above, with half timbering. Red clay tile roofs and tile-hung bays. Georgian small windows set in metal casements with wooden frames and sills. Previous craftsmanship gave way to machine-made products. Furniture used whitewood and ply stained to resemble polished walnut. Carpet squares surrounded by lino, parquet hall floors and decorated stair spindles, all treated with dark oak stain. Quarry tile kitchen floors, butler sinks, fire-back water boilers and gas cookers. Open fires in all living rooms with wood mantel above, tile surrounds. Bedrooms had iron fire grates and fitted wardrobes, sash windows, landing lights, front door lights and side windows leaded with stained glass. Between large-scale building sites of semi-detached houses, bungalows, modern and Art Deco styles existed, dividing the more conventional style with their flat roofs, zigzag and fan windowed patterns, painted concrete bays and sun-trap curved windows. The construction sites were organized for multiple building techniques on a grand scale that gave a quick turnaround of work, completing large sites in a 4-year period, mostly all before 1936. Cutler homes. The majority of houses built in North Harrow were Cutler homes. Albert Benjamin Cutler came from Tottenham. He began building in 1909, but most of his work was in North Harrow and Pinner during the early 30s. His son Horace took over, becoming Mayor of Harrow, then leader of the Greater London Council, and then finally knighted in 1979. Albert Cutler lived in Beresford Road, Marsh Road, and lastly in Eastcote Road. He was closely associated with the Imperial Properties Investment Company, then Amalgamated London Properties, and during the period 1925 to 1939, T.F. Nash Limited had 3 large estates for developing. One was at Eastcote, where he lived, another at Kenton, and a third at Rayners Lane. They were the most economical. Then, on the way to Pinner, that ranged from £595 to £750, 4 up, 2 down, with a garage. Light industry. Depending on the industry, production started to push ahead in the early 30s. The first factories to set up the wheels in motion were the new electric consumer goods: cookers, refrigerators, irons, toasters and vacuum cleaners. Radios, telephone equipment and cameras also felt greater sales being recorded. All these items needed ancillary parts to be manufactured. Indeed, this was not heavy industry, but it had to start somewhere. Steel output rose from a low 5 million tons in 1932 to 13 by 1937. Coal production had stabilized and productivity started to rise at a steady pace to reach its old peak by 1938. It was a marked change in textiles. Cotton never succeeded in reaching its previous high, but woolen certainly did. Generally, the 30s, in comparison to other European countries, are described as being an improvement on the previous era in the 20s.